Good evening, everyone. My name is Dave Pringle. I'm a policy and campaign manager with the Center for Popular Democracy, and I'm excited to be sharing this space with you all this evening to discuss federal funding and how the money that we all contribute to the federal government through our tax dollars flows into states and localities, and how we can most effectively make use of that money and prevent it from being sent to the carceral state, policing, prisons, and jails. Really quickly, I just want to go through our agenda. We're going to just do a quick welcome grounding exercise. We'll talk a little bit about who the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom is and the organizations that make up the coalition. We'll do a little bit about the 1994 crime bill, a federal funding overview, and then we'll have an amazing panel share their expertise on the flow of federal funding. And then we'll talk about some next steps and some calls to action for how we can best advocate on this issue. So the first thing that I'd like for you all to think about is just, if you could spend $1 million in your community, what do you think you would spend it on? And feel free to share your ideas in the chat. And take a couple seconds to just think about, if you could control our federal budget, if you were in charge of putting together the way that we allocate our tax dollars, what are the sorts of things you would spend it on? MLK said budgets are moral documents. And if that's the case, how do we think our morals would be replicated in the way that we put our budget together? Let's take a couple seconds to put that in. I'm seeing some great ones: education, public banks, food insecurity, housing, family support, recreation centers, mental health services. These are fantastic. And one thing I'm noticing as I'm seeing all of these responses come in is I'm not seeing police anywhere in there. I'm not seeing the increased militarization of police. I'm not seeing police in our schools. I'm not seeing more money for prisons and jails. And so just thinking about what that means for our ability to influence the federal budget, knowing that we select our elected officials and our elected officials are the ones who put the federal budget together, it's interesting to see how our federal budget is currently composed and what the things are that you all are most interested in. We can go to the next slide. So what is the People's Coalition for Safety and Freedom, also known as the People's Coalition, or PCSF? It's essentially a coalition of organizations that are made up of base building and member-led grassroots organizations, including racial justice, policy, and advocacy institutions. The coalition is primarily led by Black and queer organizations, and we ultimately represent a cross-section of communities that are impacted by different systems of criminalization and incarceration across the country. Many of our organizations are operating in individualized localities across the country with different chapters. Some of our organizations are operating on national issues with a federation of affiliates that support our work across the country. And so if you go to the next slide, you can see this is the steering committee of the People's Coalition. And so there you've got BYP 100, Center for Popular Democracy, Black Alliance for Just Immigration, Dream Defenders, Leadership Conference Education Fund, Law for Black Lives, Justice Leadership USA, Policy Link, Action Center for Race and the Economy, National Council for Incarcerated and Formerly Incarcerated Women and Girls. And if you go to the next slide, yep. So that's our goal there. Our mission as a coalition is to aim to dismantle and replace racist and harmful and punitive policies that have fueled the crisis of criminalization and incarceration facing the United States, with policies and budgets that invest in communities and decarcerate our country. Next slide. So it's hard to talk about federal funding, especially any federal funding that involves policing, without talking about the 94 crime bill. Many of you are probably aware the 94 crime bill was one of the most devastating pieces of legislation that has been passed in the last few decades. And it primarily harms Black and brown folks in the way that it funnels money towards the carceral state. But there's some just quick stats there. It was passed in '94 under President Bill Clinton, drafted largely by our current president, Joe Biden. The underlying idea there was that if we can lock people away, that will make our communities safer. And so there are several different provisions that came as a result of the 94 crime bill. And many of our panelists will discuss the way that the federal government influences local policy, even though most justice policy is enacted at the state and local level. What we'll come to learn is that the federal government dramatically influences those policy decisions by creating incentives in the way that grants and other federal programs are structured to determine who can gain access to those funds. And so things like truth in sentencing laws, three strikes rules, ending Pell Grants for those in prison. These are all provisions that were created in the 94 crime bill that, again, created incentives for states to pass these sorts of laws in order to gain access to money that the federal government had allocated for some of these issues. So if we go to the next slide. So just some more numbers on the 94 crime bill. As you can see, the numbers are staggering. When it was initially passed, there was $30.2 billion allocated over the 6 years from 95 to 2000. The majority of those dollars were designated for law enforcement and prison infrastructure, 23 billion for law enforcement and prison construction, 7 billion for crime prevention, 10.8 billion for several programs that assisted state and local law enforcement, mostly for hiring more police. There's a program specifically called the Cops Office, which has funneled more than $1 billion into the expansion of policing and surveillance in schools. And so you think about augmenting the school to prison pipeline. This is a clear and direct result of things like the 94 crime bill. And just to give you an example, in 1994, 62% of VAWA money, which is the Violence Against Women's Act, which is another part of the 94 crime bill, was dedicated to the criminal legal system. By 2013, that number rose to 84%. In 2017, $250 million was sent directly to courts, police, and prosecutors. Just to demonstrate, where the bulk of funding goes in grants to localities, and the way that it ends up funding policing, thinking about the Violence Against Women's Act specifically, there's something called the STOP grant, which kind of determines how those funds were being allocated at the local level. Violence Against Women Act has several grant programs, but one of the largest is the STOP program, and STOP stands for Services, Training, Officers, and Prosecutors. The STOP program dictates by statute that state governments must allocate 25% of their funding for law enforcement, 25% for prosecutors, 30% for victim services, 5% to state and local courts, and 15% is discretionary. Traditionally, that 10% that you see labeled as discretionary, that allocation can go to any organization depending on the services that organization offers. Next slide. So this is just the next slide, please. So this is So this is just an example of how our federal budget is comprised. You can see that most of the budget goes towards national defense, Social Security, and other major health programs. By the way, these numbers come from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And you can see where that money is being distributed. Now, often that money, usually some of the entities that receive the majority of that funding goes towards policing. And we're going to talk a little bit about what are some of the obstacles in deciding who gets that money and how it gets distributed. Next slide. So this is just a breakdown of the CARES Act, which many of you probably remember Congress passed last year in the midst, just as the pandemic was sort of kicking off. March 25th, 2020 actually is the exact date. And what this does is this breaks down how the different elements of the CARES Act were distributed. And so there's state and local aid. And then you also have the Paycheck Protection Program, or what was described as PPP loans. So the CARES Act had a variety of measures that were designed to address issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. And overall, the CARES Act appropriated roughly $2.2 trillion of spending, tax breaks, loans, and other resources over the next decade. And this bill disperses funding through both general block grants, just think of like aid to states and local governments, and also through more narrowly tailored program-specific grants like the PPP program and what are known as EIDL loans, or economic injury disaster loans. So this table kind of just runs through how some of that money was distributed. You can see $150 billion was allocated for state and local aid. You can see that the way that local governments will often shift that money in towards policing. So for example, you see that this city of Chicago gave $281 million, which is 60% of its discretionary funding to the Chicago Police Department. Similarly, the way that the PPP loans were distributed reflected, the historic patterns of discriminatory lending that, the economic nature of our government has just demonstrated, for decades, for centuries now, really. And so Black businesses and nonprofits have a really hard time gaining access to these loans. And so that's part of why we wanted to have this conversation with you all, to be able to talk about how some of this money is being distributed and how we can ensure that it's going towards things that we think actually keeps our society safe, healthy, and free, which is not more police, more prisons, and more jails. If we want to go to the next slide. So the American Rescue Plan Act was another major investment that happened not long after President Joe Biden came into office. It was signed into law on March 11th of this year. And that provided about another $2 trillion in economic relief. And you can see there, again, it was designed to respond to the economic impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, including through aid to households, small businesses, nonprofits, and provided premium pay to essential workers, making up to $13 an hour or $25,000 per worker over and above the regular wage. Next slide. So this chart, similarly to the CARES Act, breaks down how the American Rescue Plan was divided and how the funds were distributed. And so you had emergency rental assistance program as one example. Childcare programming is another. You can see 21.5 billion went towards funding low-income households that were at risk of losing their homes because of the pandemic. 15 billion went towards childcare and the Childcare and Development Fund, which provided about 24 billion for childcare stabilization grants. And the Department of Homeland Security actually provides guidance on funding. You can see the challenges administratively when it comes to ensuring that the right people are getting access to this money, not unlike the PPP loans. It's a challenge to make sure that especially disadvantaged low-income households are being able to go through what's a very confusing applications process. So it's pretty clear, you can tell that the way that this money is being distributed isn't being distributed or with a mind of how do we make this easy for folks. It's not rooted in tenants' rights. It's not rooted in how to make life easier for regular folks, but really it's coming from, a bailout of landlords. And that's part of the reason why we think it's important to have a conversation about how do we create a process that allows people to be able to access these funds in a way that is useful and effective. Next slide. And so remember in the beginning when I asked you all, if you were in charge of the federal government budget, where would you allocate the funding? And so we're of the opinion that it should not go to more police, more prisons and jails. We're of the opinion that if we're going to spend billions of dollars of your hard-earned money, then that money should go towards things like social services, housing assistance, direct cash assistance, vaccine distribution. It's shocking that in the middle of a pandemic, we can still find hundreds of millions of dollars to put more police on the streets, but we can't help people pay their rent or keep their lights on or provide the critical services that they really need in order, again, to feel truly safe, healthy, and free. And so, next slide. When we ask ourselves, who should be deciding where that funding goes? We think the community should be deciding. We think local grassroots organizations and organizers, those who are directly impacted by whether it's the carceral system or whether it's by the pandemic or those who are economically disenfranchised, and really, the people who experience the majority of the consequences of decisions that our lawmakers make. Right? We live in a country where folks tend to vote and they vote if they vote, and then they kind of leave it. And if we don't stay engaged, then it's very easy for lawmakers to make decisions that don't continue to reflect the needs of our communities. And so that's part of why we're excited to have this conversation with you all, and part of why we're inviting you all to learn a little bit more about this issue. So I'm going to introduce some of our panelists really quick. We have Thea Sebastian from the Civil Rights Corps, Courtney Sanders from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, Jared Knowles from Community Hub, Kelly Coleman from Communities of Color United for Racial Justice, and me, your moderator, Dave Pringle at the Center for Popular Democracy. And with that, I'll be happy to toss it over to Thea, who will tell us a little bit more about federal spending.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Dave. I actually have a little PowerPoint that I put together for you guys. Just give me 1 second here. All right, we should be up and running. So what I would love to do over the next 10 minutes is just give everyone some basics on how federal dollars flow down to state and local governments. And then what are some of the key things that advocates might want to know to understand the restrictions on that funding and how they might be able to influence that process. So just to start off, I would love to go ahead and put some of this information into historical context, because I think when we're understanding the role that federal funding has played in fueling the carceral state, we need to understand both sides of the equation, which is the increase in funding for incarceration, which we've been talking about earlier with the 94 Crime Bill, but also understanding what has been going on with federal funding going for important social priorities, like all of the things that were showing up in the chat earlier on in this webinar. And so the way that story really unfolds is that from the 60s to the 80s, as you see on here, there was actually a substantial increase in the amount of money that was going to state and local governments. So a lot of that began with Great Society, and then it really continued over the next decade and a half, until there became a pretty important turning point in how we were giving money to state and local governments. That turning point happened under President Reagan. And as you can see on here, there was a pretty sharp constriction or a pretty sharp reduction in money that was going down to first to state governments and then to local governments. And the way that transition happened was that we took a lot of the grants that we were giving for all sorts of different priorities, and we merged them into these enormous block grants. And you can see that happen in 1981. And when we did that, we cut the money that was going for these social priorities by a quarter. And then over the next few decades, unfortunately, that trend has really continued. And so when we look at things like the welfare reform that happened in the 1990s, that has gotten a lot of attention, it's really just one more step in that trajectory that started in the 1980s. And so pushing forward, to understand some of the ways that the federal government has also played a role in exacerbating incarceration. The 94 Crime Bill is, of course, a huge milestone there. So as we heard earlier, that bill resulted in $12.5 billion in grants, the bill to expand correctional facilities, and a lot of that money was explicitly tied to incentivizing states to adopt truth in sentencing laws that further increase the carceral population. But there's another data point in here that I think is important for this story, and this is one that's a little bit more recent. But during the Great Recession, a lot of local governments in particular ran into major budget shortfalls. And because they had these requirements to keep their budgets balanced, what they ended up doing was ratcheting up the fines and fees that they were imposing on people in their jurisdictions. So a pretty famous example of how this played out on the ground is Ferguson, which ultimately led to the uprising there and also to the Department of Justice report that got a lot of attention. But really, it's not just a Ferguson problem. This is happening everywhere. And one point to just make here is that that was also a choice of the federal government. The federal government could have stepped in and it could have given money to local governments to plug that budget gap. And because it didn't, that's one of the reasons we ended up with this increase of fees and fines that continues to have truly devastating consequences, including catching people up in the criminal legal system simply because they're unable to pay those fines and fees off. So pressing forward, there is a final turning point as part of this kind of historical overview, and that's actually the moment that we're in now. So over this last year, we have seen in many ways unprecedented infusions of federal dollars into the state and local governments across the country. So the American Rescue Plan, which you'll be hearing much more about, is a great example. The CARES Act, which you already heard about. But in many ways, this funding is a real opportunity to just rethink what our social contract is. You know, as part of these dollars, we now have a child tax credit, which is giving money to people to help care for their kids, which is something that many Western European nations already do, regardless of a global pandemic. And so this turning point is something that I think is a really important moment for advocates to help harness to try to get these dollars for the good purposes to stay, while making sure that these dollars aren't going to simply replicate the harms of the 94 crime bill. So then, just zooming back a little bit from this historical overview, okay, cool. Got about halfway through. So thinking about what the purpose of federal funding is, so really there are three main purposes. The first one is simply to provide funding for really important activities. So schools, roads, healthcare, things like that. The second main function is to help state and local governments weather these sorts of huge transitions in the economy. So things like COVID, where there's simply no way that even if the government is planning ahead at the state level, they're not going to be able to withstand this historic drop in tax revenue and all sorts of other money being collected. And then the third reason why the federal government is giving money to states and localities is to incentivize them to do things that the federal government wants them to do. And the idea there is that the federal government doesn't have the legal authority to tell states and local governments exactly what to do because of our federalist system of government. But what it can do is it can offer them dollars and then attach some strings to those dollars if those local governments want to take that. Now, this power is not unlimited. There's some pretty important restrictions on how the federal government can condition funding. So the restriction has to relate to what the grant purpose actually is. And also the federal government can't structure that funding in a way that is viewed as coercive. And if you have questions about what that means, happy to answer them, but we'll just leave it there for now. So then getting in a little bit to what these funding flows look like. So there are two main baskets of funding. So there is mandatory funding, which is oftentimes thought about as like entitlement funding, and then there is discretionary funding. And the basic difference there is that with mandatory funding, the money is being doled out in accordance with something that is set out in a statute. And so it doesn't really matter what the price tag is, Congress is going to dole out that much money. For discretionary funding, that money is set aside every single year in an annual budget process. One way to think of it is that if I were federal funding, I would definitely want to be mandatory funding, because when you're left up to the whims of Congress every single year, it's much easier oftentimes to ratchet that funding down. It just means that it's harder to plan ahead. So then, in terms of how money gets to state and local grants, so the first thing to know is that it is a really important source of funding for these governments. So as you can see here, about a third of all state government spending is coming from federal government. And for local governments, it's a little bit less, but particularly when it comes to matters of criminal legal system, a lot of that money is still coming through some of these big grants, and just more or less depending on what jurisdiction you're actually in. There are three main types of grants to be aware of. There's formula grants, which are based on eligibility. There's project-specific grants or competitive grants. And a good example would be something like Race to the Top, where the idea is that you're giving states or local governments money to do something specific and incentivizing them to make changes oftentimes to get that money. And then there's block grants that are things like TAMPs, or temporary assistance for needy families, and CDBG, or the community development block grants. And okay, cool. I have a couple more minutes here. So when you are trying to figure out then what are the restrictions, my advice would be you want to start off by going back to whatever law was passed that set up that pot of money, because that's always going to be your gold standard. Whatever that law says is going to be what the agency that's actually running the grant program has to do. But then from there are two other places where you might look to see if there are conditions on the source of money. And so those big things are agency regulations and agency guidance. So an agency regulation is a very formalized process where an agency will set out what are the rules for how that law will be implemented. So in this case, it would be how the grant is actually going to be overseen. But then there's also agency guidance, which is kind of much softer than a regulation. It's something that has a little bit less force in the sense that it can be overturned if it feels like it's something that should have been addressed through a rule. But if you can't find an agency regulation that is explaining how the grant is supposed to be administered or doled out, then you can look to see if there was any agency guidance or it's simply any information contained in the solicitation for the grant. So just close out by saying that there are some pros and cons for how this federal funding is set up. There are definitely ways in which some of these major grants have been used to catalyze really important changes, including reforms that many folks on this call might want to see. They also have sometimes, even these grants like Burn JAG, have actually been used for programs that are non-carceral. Unfortunately, there's a lot of cons that come along with that, including the fact that when you start to fund your social policies through grants like Burn JAG, you're increasing reliance on the carceral state, and you're also turning the criminal legal system into the gateway to get these important services. And so just one thing to flag is that there are definitely lawmakers out there who are trying to really rethink that. And the People's Response Act is just a good example of a bill that tries to set up grants that fund violence prevention and all sorts of things currently funded under Burn, but only the non-carceral aspects, and doing it outside of DOJ, but through HHS instead. So I'll go ahead and I'll stop there. I know that you'll be hearing more, but happy to answer questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Thea. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Courtney Sanders from Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
Awesome. Thank you, Dave. I'm so glad to have so many people joining. It's a pleasure to be on. Again, I'm Courtney Sanders, a senior policy analyst with the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. And I'm going to take a few minutes just to build on that overview that Thea gave us, that excellent overview that Dave started us with, and talk about the basic flow of federal funds to states and localities, and then give a few examples of what and why states and advocates should be thinking about taking an anti-racist approach to recovery and focus on that flexible recovery funds from the American Rescue Plan. And we know that that's kind of like what we should be focusing on for the next few years because of the transformational and even historic opportunity policymakers have right now. So there are many sources of funds that flow from the federal government and states and localities. We all know that just from the few presentations already. And they range in so many different flexible ways. And so to give you an example, specifically, think about like Medicaid, right? It gives states many opportunities and options over what to cover and who to cover. And in their state Medicaid plan, and it's by far the biggest ongoing federal grant to states. And it accounts for about a half of federal grants to states. And that is where advocacy can focus. And oftentimes where you see that focus, because we know access to health, access to health coverage for Black women and their families has an interconnected way of balancing some of the things that we want to push for in advocacy and in our research, especially when we're thinking about criminal justice. Another example that Thea talked about was those block grants. And so block grants also offer, more flexibility, and honestly, the most flexibility. So they're basically like chunks of money with a wide range of options. And these, an example of that is like the Community Development Block Grant. And usually states and localities recipients of these block grants just submit reports to the federal government on how they are spending that money. And advocates getting involved and using those funds and being a part of those planning meetings and commenting on reports and how those funds are actually used. It's just one or two ways for you to see where you really want to go. And so there probably are many opportunities within existing funds to support ways to keep communities safe without policing. The things that we talked about are those ways. The things that you envision in your $1 million imaginary dreams are the ways that we can address community safety without policing. And the federal relief money through ARP offers unique flexibility to pursue such goals. And it's an opportunity now that we should not pass upon, okay? But whether it's ARP or community development block grants, that's one thing. Or whether the money is put to good use, it really all depends on advocacy and vigilance, which I think was what Dave was talking about when he said community should be at the center of these decisions. Earlier this year, the American Rescue Plan passed tremendous just opportunity, and this legislation will and can do an enormous amount of good for so many people and relatively quickly, right? Like in some places we're seeing that. And we know that some things will take time, but the investments made will have long-lasting impact. And the work started at the federal level, but states and localities have a major role to play to fill this opportunity and to give relief to communities that are most impacted by COVID in this economic downturn. So just to give you a quick overview, I know Dave did a little bit of it, but I want to catch folks up to speed again on, what the American Rescue Plan tried to accomplish and what the CARES Act did in the early stages of the pandemic. What we saw was that in the early response of COVID-19, we had the Family First CARES Act, and it did things like had big UI, unemployment insurance benefit boost. We saw those direct stimulus payments, what people are calling, I'm one of those people, stimmies, right? Some state fiscal aid, health and housing assistance, expanded, family medical leave, and also food benefits. We also saw in the CARES Act things like student loan forbearance and eviction moratoriums and state and local relief efforts. And then we come to this year with the American Rescue Plan, with that $1.9 trillion, further reaching for fiscal economic relief. Some of the things that it provides is unprecedented cash and near cash resources to families, provides significant investments in key areas like housing and homelessness, in childcare and education and health coverage. And more significantly, it provided flexible resources, that $350 billion to help states, localities, tribes, and territories meet their COVID-19 related challenges and really think about how to build a better future. And ARP is what I'll be calling American Rescue Plan throughout the presentation. So if you hear ARP, that's what I mean. Funds were very broad, which is why it's a unique package from the federal government. For example, it's saying you can pay for things like broadband, water projects, pandemic recovery for people and businesses, public health, replacing revenue declines caused by the pandemic, premium pay for workers, like Dave mentioned. And federal guidance is also trying to push explicitly states and localities to spend money or spend funds in ways that promote equity and put flexibility in the way that lawmakers find it hard to do sometimes. I will step back a little bit and say there are some critiques about the flexibility, but overall, when you have the right representation in your state and locality, it's nothing but like dream big and dream as big as you can because of this historic opportunity. Getting back to the $350 billion of this flexible funds for states and other governments, we see that there is an allocation of $195 billion going to states, $65 billion going to cities, and $65 billion going to counties. And all cities and counties get half of their funds now. So that means your people got it. And then half in a year. And about 20 states got all of their money now. And then the other 30 will get their half now and then half in a year. And all states have until the end of 2024 to spend these funds. And there's so much more in our Federal Scoop website. I'll make sure that I put that in the chat, but we basically wrote recommendations with the US Treasury guidance on how states and localities can spend this money. So I'm gonna spend a little bit of time of talking about that. But if you don't remember, I said that I would make sure we had a moment to think about how states and advocates can do this dreaming big, if you will, in an anti-racist way. I wrote this paper a while ago called The 3 Principles to an Anti-Racist and Equitable State Response to COVID-19 and a Strong Recovery. And I wanted to pick this lens for state lawmakers and for advocates because this crisis has really laid to bear the ways our nation's history of racism, bias, and discrimination are really hardwired in our health, social, and economic systems. And then obviously the criminal justice system. And I know that this is a moment where there's opportunity to take a leap forward. But the reality is that the effects of this crisis are incredibly uneven. We see the divergence right now, right? Like how well-educated, largely white people are rebounding quite well, actually. And other people in other sectors are hit hard and are experiencing much deeper hardship than what they were already experiencing before this crisis. So all of that is to say is that states have critical policy choices to make, and community advocates have to hold them accountable. Do they want to repeat and exacerbate these inequities, which also will damage the economy, or will lawmakers chart a new course towards an anti-racist, equitable recovery that extends to all people, no matter who you are, no matter where you live, no matter how you look, because we can't go back to normal. And I really do think that this American Rescue Plan helps get us closer, if you will, to an equitable recovery. But there are state policies that states can make and implement through this frame. So I'm gonna take some time to quickly run through the 3 principles that kind of frames how we should be thinking about getting to the pot of money and how we want to spend it and the priorities that we set for it. And then I'll run through those priorities and leave time for the rest of the panel. So the first principle is to target aid to those most in need due to COVID-19. The second is to advance anti-racist and equitable policies for the short and the long term, right? Like in this moment and for the future, to dismantle persistent racial, gender, and economic inequities. And then the third is really to prepare state revenue systems to really sustain transformative long-term investments for Black, Brown, Indigenous, Asian, immigrant, LGBTQ, and low-income communities. Because this is an important moment, and it seems like every day that's passing, what happens really in states is more important now than it was a few days ago. And what lawmakers do can really set the tone for whether we move in the status quo and maintain all the things that has really made things messed up, or we can move forward, because we know policy and policy making is self-reinforcing. So getting back to that $350 billion that the federal government gave states, localities, and tribal governments and territories. The center has written many papers about what the priorities are. And so I'm going to walk you through specific examples of how we can use the ARP funds. And I mean states and local governments can use the ARP funds to move away from policing. So the first is to build a robust outreach operation. There's a core idea here that the ARP funds include a range of direct assistance to help people pay for things like rent, buy food, access to childcare, and other needs. But this will have less impact if people are unaware of what's available. So all the advocates on the call, we need you, right? To make sure that people are getting the things that are laid out in this $1.9 trillion package, both from the federal level and at the state and local level. So launching a public awareness campaign in order to help people learn about available benefits and direct them to resources for how to access them is really something we can be thinking about, and honestly, something that I think will really propel a lot of communities. The other thing is that states can build comprehensive support systems for people with substance use disorders, for example, with a rich array of treatment services and recovery supports. So ARP has already embedded some language that enhance Medicaid matches for 24/7 behavioral health crisis intervention. So states and localities, they can use that money for that. Also, states and localities can expand support for people with mental health challenges and target these programs, especially to low-income areas and communities of color where there's adequate and affordable mental health services, particularly are lacking. The other thing is they can take police out of schools and create wraparound services for students and their communities. Many parents are shopping for school supplies right now, and we are all questioning, will there be police at these schools, right? And so that's something that we can think about for supporting our kids is stop spending money for police in schools and think about all the wraparound services our kids need. Provide direct cash payments, especially to populations that were disproportionately harmed by the crisis. And states and localities could use this funds to help transition away from those criminal legal fines and fees that are funding the court and police systems that Thea talked about earlier. But again, these are opportunities, recommendations, and priorities, but this is not mandated. Advocates have to push for it. And so over the long term and beyond ARP, you might want to encourage federal governments to undo the impacts of the '94 crime bill and to start funding transformational and transformative approaches to community safety, including things like authorizing legislation. I'll stop here because I know I'm over time and just say this, that the good news is if we're intentional about policy choices that create persistent inequities like the '94 crime bill, then we can be intentional about policy choices that can also move us forward to an anti-racist and equitable future. And that is what we have to remain like laser focused on, y'all, both in our current context, but in future. So with that, I will pass it off to Dave and Jared.
Thanks so much. Jared, why don't you take it away?
Thanks so much, Dave. And I really like that Courtney ended with the good news. I'm going to try to keep some of the good news going, and I'm going to stay focused on the ARP aid. I'll probably slip up and call it ARPA, but I'm Jared Knowles. I'm with the Community Resource Hub, and I'm also the president of Civil Ethics Consulting, which is a company that I run that has done some work around ARPA funding specifically. The lens I'm coming at this from is the very local, the county and city government. So I've read and analyzed dozens of city and county budgets over the last 18 months, specifically for community organizations that are looking to divest from the carceral state and to invest in alternatives that provide real safety to their communities. So I'm looking at the county, the city lens, and what does the ARPA mean for this? And I want to note that what Courtney said, the ARPA actually has a lot of really lofty ideals in it for both a piece of legislation, specifically for the state and local aid provisions, and in the rulemaking that Treasury has proposed so far, specifically giving a much wider set of flexibility if the money is spent to address disparities, especially racial disparities in public health and economic outcomes, even if they were pre-existing from the pandemic. So the problem with that is it has lofty ideals, but how do we make those happen is through local power. And I saw folks talking about that in the chat, and that's absolutely correct. So there's many threats to achieving those ideals. So one threat is that the carceral state's organized, inside actors with advanced political knowledge and connections. They have been working and have policy proposals and have plans to already spend this money, and they want to make it seem like it's spent. A lot of cities and counties have already passed a budget this fiscal year that included or allocated some of their ARPA money potentially. And we also can see that, things that we all might want, like cash assistance to families to buy school supplies, they don't have necessarily an organized constituency. So let's talk about what can be done about that with respect to ARPA. So the first thing to recognize about ARPA actually is that it is so much money. It's $200 per person for a county, and depending on your city, your specifics for your city, it could be between $100 and $1,000 per person that your city is receiving. And you get half of that now and half of that later. That's actually a political problem for every city and every county government, because spending that kind of money well is going to be the measure that they're going to be held accountable for, and everyone is going to want a piece of the pie. So I have a saying, when I worked in a budget office in Wisconsin, we used to say, when it rains cash, those with the buckets get it. And the prisons and police have really big buckets, and so they are already organized to get it. So let's talk about ways to keep it out and what we've seen. So one trend we're definitely seeing is that in this fiscal year, most cities and counties adopted some flimsy language that they were going to allocate some of their ARPA money, but not all of it. And they gave very few specifics about where it was going to go. The majority of large cities and counties that I've looked at so far have basically held off on the process that they're going to use to spend ARPA money. And instead, you'll see that there's a lot of press about how ARPA money may be spent in those cities. And so that's a strategy that political insiders want to say, oh, the city's going to, we haven't formally adopted yet, but the city is going to use ARPA money to pay for the hotel industry to come back, or to give bonus pay to police officers. But in most cases right now, the money came out on May 10th, roughly, depending on how fast your city was on the application. The money is actually maybe has been appropriated, but it certainly hasn't been expended. And so when we get to this compressed window between now and 2024, when this large sum of money needs to be passed through our government and expended, the one challenge is that what does it actually mean for the money to be spent? Well, it has to go out of the bank account, right? And it depends on how your local government does its financing. But even when your government sets a budget for the year, the budget changes throughout the annual budget cycle. So things happen, they lose some employees, or they want to gain some employees, and they make adjustments. The same thing's going to happen with ARPA aid. So there will be a big decision-making period where, okay, we're going to set up some general allocations like we would with a budget. And some communities are doing this very democratically with listening sessions, and other communities are doing it behind closed doors. But either way, that once those decisions are made, they're not really final until the money is spent. And so I want to lean into this good news and say, learning about this now, getting organized now, there's still plenty of time over the next several years to redirect and reinforce the idea that this money could be better spent on other things that communities are demanding. So I think that's really important to talk about. The second thing, and Courtney and Thea both talked about this too, is that this is the moment to be bold in making demands. Because, like I said, the political problem is not a politics of austerity, it's a politics of abundance. And so actually politicians are looking to discharge money, and prisons and police are extremely expensive black holes of funding. And so they are a very easy place to write out a big chunk of this as being spent, and it will make some constituency happy. So when we make alternative demands, we should make them really big. And communities are making really big demands. Cash assistance is a really clear and easy big demand that a lot of communities are making. And we've captured some of that on our website, what we've seen, and there's some of that in some of the resources that have been shared. So I think those are important things to think about, that, if you just think about $200 per person in your community, you can really go a long time for that. And you can really spend a lot on that. And so a couple other things I want to just put out there quickly is one, you want to be able to kind of get the right amount of money that you can you can see. So we have tools at Civilytics, and the link will be shared in the chat, where you can look up how much your city and county will get. Two, you want to start advocating for specific, big, bold demands that meet the needs of your community. And we have examples on our website. There's examples in the resource guide shared. And the key there is put a very big price tag on them. Because you're not going to get extra bonus points for being fiscally responsible when you're making these demands right now. That's not the situation that cities and counties are finding themselves in. And the third thing I want to say is that now we all have to be really vigilant and really loud, not just about how the money is spent, but the process by which it is allocated. Because there's in no state is there like very specific rules that ensure that every city and every county follows some very specific procedure to give out money at this level, right? So your city and counties have charters that describe their budget process, but ARPA doesn't necessarily fall under that process. And the Treasury so far has refused to issue any guidance on how it's going to evaluate the transparency through which the decisions about the funding are made. So we'll definitely want to make sure that we are arguing about the process as well. And the process we should use in our mind here, we should hold up as not the best process, but one that's already being used, is the same as the budget process. Because in some communities, the ARPA aid is equivalent to 1/5 of the total budget of your community, or 1/4 of the discretionary spending in your community, we've seen. So it should follow a similarly open and transparent process, a process that could be improved, but that should be the bare minimum of entry. And if politicians aren't willing to do that, that should make them a target of advocacy for that as well. Because they may say the decision was made, behind closed doors, we decided to give Hilton all the money to offset their losses during the pandemic. But until that money is spent and the money leaves the checking account, there's still democratic ways to show up to town meetings, make politicians uncomfortable, make them change or reconsider. And I want to just emphasize that there's a strong reason why you're hearing people say, oh, it's already done. We've already spent it. We've already allocated it. They don't want it to be contested. They don't want it to be debated. Unfortunately, in some communities, we are going to have to make that the case. And so I'm just here as the budget guy to say, until the check is written and it clears the account, there's still a chance to change it. And we still have plenty of time. We're very early in this ARPA allocation. The final regulations from Treasury are going to come out in the next 30 to 60 days. And so a lot of places are holding their money until they get the clarity on those final decisions about those use cases. And we have a lot of information about that on our website. We have an FAQ about the Treasury regulations, how you can tie different types of proposals you might want to make in your community to different acceptable use cases under it. So that's the budgetary background, and I'll turn it back over to Dave and the next panelist. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Jared. Really appreciate that breakdown, especially reminding everyone that there's still time to fight for this money to be equitably distributed to the things that we care about. Next, I want to toss it over to Kelly Coleman, who actually has a story of how you actually were able to get CARES money for direct relief checks in Austin. Kelly, we're so happy to have you. Please go ahead.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Dave. My name's Kelly Coleman. I'm a member of Communities of Color United for Racial Justice. It's a grassroots organization in Austin, Texas. And basically, since 2015, we've been organizing around the city budget, pushing to try to make people's lives better, right? Sorry, y'all. I have 3 kids too, so. Whenever we were dealing with the CARES Act money, or trying to push around that, a lot of what we used were examples from before to convince city officials to use CARES Act money, right? There was a pilot that our organization participated in to do guaranteed income, or we called it RISE funds, relief in a state of emergency. And we did $1,000 stipends to families. It was very simple process where folks folks would go into this this organization that's not called FII anymore, but formerly FII, and you would say whether or not you were experiencing hardship because of COVID and lost a job, or whether you were low income to begin with, and whether you needed money for rent. And you would provide proof of, we didn't even have proof of residency, I don't think, in that one. And people were able to get direct deposited or a gift card for $1,000 for their family. And we participated in that along with several other organizations to provide that. And it was super successful. There was a lot of pushback around the CARES Act, around the CARES money. There were a lot of reasons why we were told that the city couldn't use federal dollars for something like that. But the more that, you know, we were able to mobilize the folks who benefited from the original disbursement of dollars at the beginning of the pandemic, came out and like talked about their experience with RISE and the direct cash assistance versus, you know, some of the other, unfortunately, some of the other programs that were really hard to get through to get assistance, right? And also talked about just like, you know, being able to have dignity, to have access to dollars to take care of your own business, right? To pay your rent, to pay for food, to decide what the priority was in your family. Some of the challenges I think that we had were really there were these weird questions from some of our city council members, just like, you know, how will people use the money, right? How do we make sure people are using the money the way that they're supposed to be, right? And things like that. But the more stories that were told, the more people we had who were directly experiencing the benefit of this, I think it sort of eased those things. And it was also a quick way to get the money out there. So we ended up, our public health department ended up dispersing those funds through that. And I think the lessons learned are really what we're all talking about now, is that, you know, the people who are the most directly impacted are really the folks with the solutions, and really should be the folks that we listening to, and that we're following the leadership of and supporting the leadership of, especially when it comes to money. And I think somebody mentioned, you know, Martin Luther King, the whole thing around, you know, budgets are a moral document, right? That's really what we are about and what we pushed. I think too, and Austin is one of the cities that we heard was being sort of put out there as a place to send some of the dollars for the to remedy some of the defunding of police departments. And we're also the city that I think divested the most until our governor intervened from our police department. So we make the connection between all of it, right? The money that we're spending on policing, Austin has like a $500 million budget. Meanwhile, our public health department has been underfunded for years. Since 2015, we've been trying to get more money to that. And even in a pandemic, right? It was. And so we've been trying to make the connections between those carceral systems, gentrification, you know, health outcomes, and housing, and trying to make that real, so that the folks that we're organizing are able to, you know, are able to get what we need, right? get what they need out of this. Yeah. I don't know. Am I supposed to pass back to you, Dave? Was that okay?
That's perfect, Kelly, and thank you so much. I think whenever we're dealing with topics like these that tend to be dense, it's really helpful to have a direct example of how someone like yourself and your organization has actually navigated through this system and able to win dollars for your community. And so I really appreciate your perspective and what you've shared here today. We did want to leave some time for some questions that we've put together for some of the panelists, some of which they have already run through. And so one that stands out to me that I'd love to just present to you all when you're thinking about how advocates and organizers are trying to determine how do they do this? What's the best way to fight for their funding priorities? What do they need to know about federal funding in order to fight for their priorities? And what are some of the obstacles to getting the money? I know that there's some questions around offensive versus defense versus the defensive nature of advocacy. And I'm going to toss this first one to Thea, if you're able to jump on. Or anyone who, or anyone, we know that the bulk of the decisions are being made at the state level, thinking about how states can review who makes those decisions, those that are hosting or planning to host special legislative sessions on how to decide how to spend it. Anyone feel free to jump in with any of those questions.
Okay, I'll start to give time for Thea and just say, states majority of states have already done their legislative session, right? They've already kind of passed their state budgets, which means the ARP money has not been decided on what they want to do with it, more or less. We have about 25 states who've said publicly what they plan on doing with the money. And then we have about 14 states who said that they're going to have a special session to decide what to do with the money. So in those cases where there's special sessions, advocates can be a part of that process, demand to be a part of hearings, decide whether or not it makes sense to start giving commentary or even ask if testimony will be available for those public hearings. And then also think about what the priorities of the public officials in their states and localities and see if they match up. If they don't, ask for a meeting with them, ask for a meeting with their staff so that you all are on the same page about how this money should be spent, whether that's at the local or the state level. But the unfortunate thing is because of the money rolling out in May, midsummer, a lot of the sessions are over. So the normal way we would track money budgetarily would be like on the website, right, where they kind of have it all done. And so it's very easy for lawmakers to just hide it under this special session and not consult you or not get any of your feedback on how the money is being spent.
Thanks for that. Thea, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to the initial question.
Yes. Is my volume better when I lean forward? Okay. I'm so sorry about before. So in terms of tips that I would give for advocacy for priorities at the local level, I'm going to take it in a slightly different direction, which is just to say that once you figure out kind of when you need to be advocating and what the spaces are, per what Courtney was saying, I would have a clear sense of not only what your priorities are, but the data in the evidence kind of ready to go to really back that up. And to the point that I think came up with Kelly's example from Austin, thinking ahead to what the big sources of pushback are going to be against what it is that you're advocating for. And in particular, along that vein, just to uplift a few resources that might be helpful. Over these next few months, there are probably going to be a lot of conversations, as we all know, about crime. And there are probably going to be a lot of people saying that these dollars do need to be going into policing or to other carceral purposes. But there are so many great resources out there at the Community Hub. We have some at my own organization that really show that those sorts of investments are not what keep people safe. And there are all sorts of resources to show why investments in non-carceral safety truly do. And when you're having these moments where you're advocating directly to policymakers, I think having those sorts of resources just at your fingertips and ready when you know that that's going to be the pushback is going to help to make your advocacy even more impactful.
Thanks for that, Thea. And then thinking about some of the local connections with ARPA, Jared, I know you touched on some of this before in your presentation. Is there anything specific that you'd like to point out about this or anything else based on what we've discussed?
Yeah, I think sometimes local politicians, I have a very dim view of local politicians, so I'm going to just wear that on my sleeve. But many of you who've done advocacy also have a dim view of them because you recognize that we don't put our best and brightest there necessarily. So they will hide, they want to hide behind the federal money. So they're going to play the game of hide the ball, and they're going to obfuscate and try to make it seem really complicated. And so, arming yourself with the information and then just saying the same thing over and over again. No, it is okay for us to give cash payments to families in need. Yes, we do know where those families are. 100 of them came to this meeting to tell you that they are families in need and talk to you about it. We are organized. We do know where they are. That kind of thing can sort of cut through the sort of obfuscation that local officials would like to do to tell you, oh no, we already passed this resolution and we can't undo it because we passed that resolution. It's where's the money? Cut the check, do the program that we want to do, and just be really confident about that what you want to do is allowed under ARPA, and that until they tell you that the money has actually gone out the door, show us the financial statements. You have to be really firm because they're going to always just keep trying to do the least they possibly can. And so that, I think, is just what for advocates. I think advocates are very good at that. They're very good at being organized and staying on message and saying, like, this is what we need. This is how it should work. And I just want to encourage you that just follow that process, and just couple that with just big ideas. This is a big amount of money. The police aren't going in there asking for a little bit. They're going in there asking for 25% raises for every cop, right? And so you want to be big as well and say, no, we need big things for us. And so just sticking to that message and not letting them obfuscate or cloud up the issue.
Appreciate that, Jared. And then Kelly, was there anything in particular you wanted to lift up, just given where the conversation is going, based on your experience as a local advocate? Anything in particular you'd like to, specific advice or roadblocks that you encountered as you were kind of navigating this territory?
So I am a member of CCU, and I've been organizing here, and I'm actually born and raised in Austin, right? But I work for the city of Austin. So we need people internal to, I think, some of these systems to try to, cause like it's Jared's giving everybody the game right now, I feel like, because everything he's saying is true. Our budget office hide money. I mean, all of a sudden there's money to pay for this, $5 million to keep music venues open. Wait a minute. And we were arguing about the RISE money. Hold on, that's a problem, right? So everything that Jared is saying is absolutely true. And until the check is cashed, you have time, and nobody wants to be shamed and embarrassed. And that, to me, when you bring people who these folks want to be seen, in their eyes in a way that is positive, you have to use it in order for us to be okay, because there are all these other competing priorities that really aren't necessarily priorities. And I mean, our people are out here suffering right now. And I think that is the impetus. That's like what who we're most concerned about, right? Like, this isn't these aren't like notions. These are people. And I think as long as we keep people central and people who are most directly impacted, I think Courtney talked about anti-racism, and having this anti-racist sort of approach to the way that we're doing our work. You have to be clear, and hold some of these folks accountable, even when we're in relationship with them, right? And if you're outside of a system, build relationships with them folks inside, so that you know what the real deal is, right? And who's really making those decisions and what's happening, and that's what I would say, because the work that was able to get done in the city would not have happened if we were not deeply rooted and connected to people who are being most directly and negatively impacted by these systems, period. And if we weren't and if we didn't feel accountable to those folks, right?
Thank you so much. So true, Kelly. Before we close, I want to give the panel, well, first I want to thank our panelists so much for taking the time out to share this extremely important information with our attendees. But just, any last words, or in particular, is there someone or an organization you've supported or worked with that you found was able to successfully divert funding away from the carceral state? If there's anything in particular any of you would like to mention, and then we'll go ahead and pass it over to Cam.
I say in Oakland, they got some of the ARPA money that was going to go to the police to be reallocated away, but the police still didn't get a cut per se. They just got held to stay whole, but they did a heck of a job organizing around a clear set of alternatives, holding, like Kelly said, the same thing, holding politicians accountable by showing up as they went to work in the morning and catching them at home in the evening, and building coalitions of groups to hold individual city council members accountable to those demands. They have a really good story in Oakland about how they were able to do that. But I wish I could tell you it was a bigger divestment from the carceral state. But as we all know right now, anything is a really good show of strength. And I think aside from what Kelly shared, I'd say the folks in Oakland are one that I'm really watched and really appreciated seeing happen.
Awesome. Well, once again, thank you all so much for taking the time out and sharing your knowledge with all of us. If we can bring back up the original, yep, perfect. And then I'm going to toss it over to Cameron.
Perfect. Thanks again, y'all. This was so incredible. Thank you for taking time out to just share your wisdom with us as we kind of dream and scheme and figure out what we can do. So for everyone who doesn't know me yet, my name is Cameron Bell. I am the People's Process Coordinator with the Coalition. And so just want to run through very briefly what the People's Process is. As you can see on your screen right now, we're trying to catalyze national attention to repeal and replace the 94 crime bill. And as you heard about all of the ills that it caused, we're trying to replace that with a more holistic approach that actually centers directly impacted folks and actually centers what actually keeps us safe. And we know that that's not putting people away and disappearing them from our communities. And so we want to bring folks together to discuss that, engage in mass political education, and kind of just develop that language for how to replace that. Next slide, please. And so here's a great visualization of the process of how we want to do this, right? And so we're trying to work with local base building orgs to co-create these people's movement assemblies, basically like big town halls that kind of talk through what do we want to see in this replacement bill? What should we be investing in? What shouldn't we be investing in? And how can we write that together? And so we're going to be serving our communities. We're going to be engaging in political ed, and we're going to be having these people's movement assemblies across the nation to really democratize this process and not just wait on the federal government to decide how they want to do things or when they want to do things, but to present them with the bill that the people want to see implemented. Next slide. And so get plugged in. This is how you can get connected with us. Check out our website, follow us on our socials. Hope you were following along with the live tweeting tonight as well. We really want to hear from you. And if you're a part of an org that's already doing this work, doing invest, divest work, doing defund work, please sign on our interest form as well. So I can follow up with you to see how you can get connected, how we can partner as we're moving forward, because we're looking for a September launch to really get things going. So definitely fill that out if you're interested, and I will definitely follow up. And then the last thing that I'll ask for folks to do is we're going to launch a really quick poll just to give us some feedback. We love feedback here. So please take a minute, fill out the poll, let us know, how this webinar was. And we just thank you for your time. If you have any other questions, please let us know. We will be sending out a follow-up email after this with the slide deck, with the recording of tonight's webinar, and all the resources that were shared, in addition to a resource guide that we created that breaks down some of these data points and numbers and all the kind of details that we didn't have too much time to dig into. So thanks all again, and please be safe and have a great rest of your week.